The spring of 1944 showed that the English Channel is not just a supply road, but a separate front. The 10th Destroyer Flotilla, in which Haida served, sailed in a series of night operations off the French coast. The Germans kept torpedo boats, mine forces, and large ships of the Elbing type, which, according to the German classification, were considered torpedo boats, but were close to destroyers in terms of capabilities. For the Allies, the task was practical: find, impose a battle, and disrupt the enemy's exit before they reached the supply route. On the night of the 25th to the 26th of April, the flotilla encountered a German group off the northern coast of Brittany. The battle involved Haida, the Canadian Huron, and Athabaskan, the British Ashanti, and the cruiser Black. The German group included the ships T-29, T-24, and T-27. In such encounters, the first and most important thing is contact. At night, the enemy cannot be seen until he is too close. Therefore, the work of radars and discipline at the posts was critical. As a result of the battle, it is recorded that Haida sank T-29. For the viewer, this is a single line. For sailors, this is a few hours of hard work, when each department is responsible for its own. On the bridge, they keep a course, take signals, and monitor their neighbors so as not to lose their formation in smoke and flashes. In the engine room, they keep the engine revving up and are ready to change the mode instantly. Artillery crews fire in series, change their targeting angles, and deliver ammunition without delay. At the end of the same engagement, Haida collided with the Allied destroyer Ashanti. This happened against the background of maneuvers in the dark, where there is smoke around and sharp changes in course. Even without enemy hits, such minutes are dangerous. Any accident on the hull or propellers can deprive the ship of its course in the area where the enemy operates. The ship remained operational, but it was a reminder to the crew that there were no safe pauses. A few days later, an episode occurred that became a personal tragedy for the Canadian Navy and one of the most famous pages in the history of Haida. On the night of the 28th to the 29th of April, Canadian destroyers worked off the French coast, trying to intercept German forces leaving the Saint-Malo area. During the battle, Athabaskan was torpedoed and sank. Haida went after the enemy and drove the German T-27 on the rocks, then fired at it until the ship caught fire. Then the hardest part began: rescuing people from the water. At sea, it's always a compromise between the human and the tactical. The water in the canal is cold, and people caught in fuel oil quickly lose their strength. At the same time, Haida operated near the enemy's coast. Dawn makes the ship visible to aircraft, and coastal batteries can open fire. Canadian materials describe the situation directly. Haida was able to lift 42 people, and then was forced to leave because the risk was growing after April. The flotilla continued the same night exits in direct connection with the preparation of the Normandy landings. In practice, the war at sea was going on every day. The destroyers covered minefields, patrolled the entrances to the strait, kept up pressure on French bases, and broke the German raid schedule. The German calculation was simple: go out at night, hit convoys or lay mines, go ashore. The Allied calculation was even simpler: intercept before the enemy reached the transport route. When the landing began, the 10th Flotilla was assigned the role of covering the western entrance to the English Channel from surface attacks. This means that the ships were supposed to intercept German forces that would try to hit the supply lines. In this corridor were transports, tankers, landing craft, tugs, minesweepers. Any German breakthrough, even a short one, could produce a serious result. The night from the 8th to the 9th of June became one of the most famous for Haida. The Allies intercepted the German group, which included the destroyer Z-32 and Z-24, the destroyer Z-1, and the torpedo ship T-24. The flotilla command was located on the British destroyer Tartarus. He divided his forces so as to block the enemy's retreat and prevent him from going under the bank. In one group were Tartarus, Ashanti, Haida, and Huron. In the other, Eskimo and Javelin operated together with Polish destroyers. The battle scenario looks the same on paper, captured by radar. Convergence, opening fire at a distance where you can hit, maneuvers against torpedoes. But in practice, the details decide everything. Smoke screens cut visibility. Splashes from hits cover the bridge and instruments. Communication is carried out by radio and light signals, and any delay can mean the loss of the target. In such conditions, the crew works according to procedures and does not argue with orders. As a result of this night, it is recorded that Haida and Huron achieved the sinking of the German destroyer Z-32 off the island of Ile de. Another German ship was stranded and lost. This reduced the capabilities of the German fleet in the Channel at a time when the landing was being resupplied by sea. After Wesson, the flotilla continued to work almost without pauses. German U-boats and mine forces remained a threat. On the 24th of June, Haida, along with a British Eskimo, participated in the destruction of a German U-boat off Land's End at 970. In anti-submarine work, there is no duel in front of your eyes. There is contact, calculation, a series of attacks and confirmation of the result by pop-up traces and debris. By this point, the 10th Flotilla had another role to play. After the fall of Cherbourg, part of the German forces shifted to the east, and the flotilla was increasingly used as a strike group against coastal ship. Goals have become more diverse: submarine hunters, minesweepers, patrol boats, small transports. This is the same war of wear and tear, only with different goals. On the night of the 14th to the 15th of July, Haida operated with the Polish destroyer Błyskawica off the Ile-de-Groix area near Lorient. As a result of the collision, 2 German U-boat hunters were destroyed, 1 transport was sunk, and several other vessels were severely damaged. Short exit, quick strike, departure before dawn. That's what most of the canal work looked like in the summer of '44. On the ship, these months felt like a continuous service. Fatigue accumulates quickly. Dark water, flashes of gunfire, smoke, short commands, then dark water again. The officers make sure that the crews do not lose their pay. Petty officers ensure that ammunition is delivered without delay. Mechanics keep their cars running because at full speed, any malfunction turns into a stop. And in the Channel, stopping means that you become a target. After the death of Athabaskan, the crew of Haida did not receive even a day of silence. There were no quiet days in the English Channel at that time. The Germans kept fast torpedo ships and escort units off the coast of France, which went out at night, tried to attack transport routes, and then went to the bases under the cover of coastal batteries. The Allies did not just need to fight back, but to prevent these ships from affecting the supply and security of the Normandy landings. Therefore, the 10th Destroyer Flotilla again worked almost without pauses. In the first days of June 1944, the situation became even more severe. The landing was already underway, and the German command was trying to transfer forces to the battle area, as well as bring its destroyers to sea to attack the cover ships. On the night of the 8th to the 9th of June, the Allied destroyers were assigned the task of intercepting a German group near the island of Wesson, at the entrance to the western part of the English Channel. The Germans marched along the coast and tried to break through to their ports, using the darkness and speed. The German group included large destroyers and torpedo ships, and this meant a full-fledged surface battle. For Haida, this fight began as a typical nighttime interception. The radar picked up the marks. Then the scheme comes into operation, honed to automatism. Identify the direction of movement of targets. Take a favorable course. Do not go to the mines. Keep your distance so that your own torpedoes have a chance, and the artillery can quickly take aim. In a night battle, it's not the beautiful volleys that matter, but who saw it first, who understood it first, and who gave the command faster. Plus, the constant risk of making a mistake with the silhouette and confusing the destroyer with a smaller target. The error here is worth a ship. During the battle, the Allies inflicted heavy damage on the German destroyer ZH-1. It was disabled and later sank. Another German destroyer, Z-32, was cut off from its own and went to the shore, trying to escape in shallow water. Haida operated with the Canadian destroyer Huron and led the. As a result, the German ship was forced to be washed ashore near the island of Île-de-Bas. For the German commander, this was a way to save some of the crew, but the ship itself was actually lost. This episode is important because it shows the nature of the war in the Strait. The enemy does not always go to the open sea. He tries to go where the maneuver of the Allies is limited to mines, shallow water, and coastal fire. 2 weeks later, Haida found herself in a different type of battle against a submarine. On the 24th of June, she operated alongside the British destroyer Eskimo. There was contact in the area west of the English Channel, and the ships launched a series of depth charge attacks. Anti-submarine hunting usually looks more boring to the viewer than an artillery duel because most of the work is hidden. The ship follows the sonar data, makes turns, resets the series, then looks for contact again, corrects the calculation, and repeats the approach. But that's exactly how submarines are destroyed. Hard, methodical work. The result was rare that day. U-boat 971 surfaced. They opened fire on her. The boat was destroyed. Haida picked up a few survivors from the water. For the crew, it was a contrast to the April night when Athabaskan's men were pulled out of the cold sea under the threat of mines and aircraft. Now they could see the faces of the people in the water again, only they were already opponents. This is recorded dryly in the documents, but for sailors such moments are remembered for a long time. You don't see an abstract goal, but a person who is holding on to life amid. The summer continued, and with it, the night raids to the French coast continued. The Germans kept many small guard ships at Lorient and other bases. They were called submarine hunters, patrol ships, and escorts. They escorted convoys and closed the approaches to the bases. In terms of tonnage, these were not the goals for which destroyers are built. But in terms of their role, they were extremely important. These ships provided the movement of fuel, ammunition, and supplies along the coast, If they are knocked out, the supply system begins to work worse, and the German convoys have to either go with greater risks or refuse to cross at all. On the night of the 14th to the 15th of July, Haida sailed with the Polish destroyer Błyskawica. They were sent to the area near the island of Ile de Groix. There, they intercepted a German security team. The fight was short and tough. In such fights, the first minute often decides. Who earlier turned on the searchlight? Who earlier gave a sighting salvo? Who earlier realized that the enemy was trying to go under? Haida worked artillery on targets and did not allow them to disperse. As a result, the German hunters UJ 1420 and UJ 1421 were sunk, as well as another target from the escorted group. For the German side, this is not only the loss of ships, this is the loss of security and the nervous reaction of the command, which understands that the route along the coast is no longer safe, even at night. August brought another operation offshore, this time near the island of Ile d'Yeu. On the 5th and 6th of August, Haida operated as part of an operation called Kinetic. There was a hunt for German small ships and minesweepers. The danger to the destroyer in such conditions is higher than its shallow water, risk of mines, limited maneuver. The enemy knows the area better and can steer the ship so as to cover the shore or lead the attacker to a dangerous area. Plus, there's always the risk of coastal fire. Even if the battery doesn't hit directly, a close break can cause shrapnel and disable people and appliances. That night, Haida attacked German units, among which the minesweeper M486 is mentioned. The fight was tough. In the course of the actions, Haida suffered losses. This is important because around Haida, there is a reputation for a ship that went through a lot of battles with almost no losses. In fact, the risk was constant, and sometimes it worked. Dead sailors are not statistics. This is the price that the crew pays for the fact that the ship remains in service and continues to crush the enemy on its routes. Inside the ship, these weeks looked like a repetition of the same procedures, but in constant tension. On the navigation bridge, the watch officer holds the course and listens to reports. The radio room accepts signals but tries not to light up on the air. In the central post and at the gun crews, people sleep fitfully next to their seats. The destroyer is always cramped, but in combat mode, it gets even more cramped. Everyone knows that if the alarm goes off at night, they have minutes to get in position. In the night battles of the English Channel, radar was an important tool. It doesn't give you a win by itself, but it does give you the first seconds. These seconds allow you to take up a position, choose an angle of attack, launch a torpedo salvo, or open fire from your guns before the enemy knows they've been found. The Germans also had their own resources, but the Allies at that time had an advantage in detection systems. In practice, this meant that Canadian destroyers were often the first to see the target and could impose The artillery on Haida was operating in a mode that looks almost unbelievable to a landsman. The barrels heat up, the crew works out the supply of projectiles, and the adjustment is based on flashes and marks. The discipline of fire was especially important at Ouessant. Shooting a lot doesn't mean shooting effectively. You need to keep up the pace so that you don't lose control and don't get blinded by the smoke. In narrow waters, smoke can cover the target and simultaneously cover its own escape. Therefore, the commanders constantly balanced between the speed of fire and control. After the battles, other work began. inspection of the building, checking mechanisms, inventory of ammunition, search for damage from close breaks. At sea, you don't need a direct hit to create a problem. The shock wave can damage equipment, disrupt connections, and break appliances. The destroyer keeps on speed and maneuvering. If you lose speed, you become vulnerable. Therefore, the mechanics and electricians after each exit worked as if the next battle would start right now. A separate topic is saving people. In April, it was their own. In June, after the destruction of the submarine, it was the opponent's. In both cases, the decision is made by the commander, but performed by the crew. Launching a dinghy at night in cold water means risking your crew. Getting close means risking a mine or an attack. But leaving people in the water means making a different decision that not everyone can bear. In practice, Haida and the other ships operated according to the situation. Where possible, people were raised. Where the risk was too great, the ships left. And this later remained in the memory of people as the most difficult. By the end of the summer, the front in France had changed. The Allies were advancing. German bases on the Atlantic coast became less secure. Some of the German forces went deeper into the North Sea, and some lost the ability to act as before. For Haida, this meant a change in the nature of the service. There are fewer clean night duels off the coast of Brittany and more tasks for patrolling and anti-submarine defense. But the experience that the ship has gained over these months has not disappeared. It was recorded in the crew's habits, in how quickly people reacted to contact, how they kept discipline at their posts, how they acted in case of damage, and when rescuing people. By the fall of 1944, Haida was sent for repairs and training for further service. The ship was exhausted not only from fighting, but also from exertion. Metal gets tired. Mechanisms need to be replaced. People need to be restored. Inside the crew, it looked like a rare opportunity to exhale. But even in the dock, the war wouldn't let up. The exercise continued. The crews were cleaning and putting the guns in order. Radio operators practiced procedures. The crew knew that after repairs, the ship would return to sea. Then the war in Europe shifted to the north. In 1945, the Allies increased pressure on German supply lines in Norway. Convoys, minefields, and coastal batteries also operated. And there again, they needed destroyers that could work in difficult navigation and bad weather. For Haida, this was a continuation of the same logic. Intercept, prevent passage, disrupt supplies, force the enemy to spend forces on security and repairs. The most valuable thing in the history of Haida for a documentary video is the opportunity to show the war in the Strait without fiction. Night, a mark on the radar, a sharp turn on the battle course, hands-free commands, flashes of guns, a short distance, and then darkness again, where no one is sure that the enemy will not give a torpedo in response. And all this is repeated many times until the war is. After the Battle of Wesson Island, Haida's crew hardly rested. The late spring of 1944 in the English Channel is a continuous change of patrols and alarms. German torpedo boats and destroyers left their bases in Brittany and Normandy in short bursts, taking advantage of the darkness, coastal batteries, and knowledge of the fairway. Their calculation is simple. Approach quickly, fire the torpedoes, engage in a short skirmish, and get under cover of the shore. The Allies responded just as pragmatically. Keep night watches, conduct radar searches, raise the alarm instantly, and prevent the enemy from operating freely off the coast. Haida was part of such a system, a Canadian tribal-class destroyer, fast, well-armed, and designed for night operations, where not beautiful maneuvers decide, but discipline on the bridge and the speed of work of calculations. No one can see the flags in the dark. They only see flashes and silhouettes. Therefore, the most important thing is order. Who looks at the radar screen? Who conducts visual surveillance? Who transmits data to the central post? Who gives the command to open fire? A mistake in this chain is not only worth a miss, it can cost a ship. In the Canadian Navy, Haida was already considered a very active unit. In her biography, short phrases quickly appeared: a night battle, a target sunk, a target damaged, people picked up from the water. But behind these lines, there was a job that outwardly seemed simple: watch, the helmsman, signalman, gun crews, the engine room, which should keep the speed and not overheat the mechanism, and a commander who makes a decision based on an incomplete picture. At night, you can always see less than you want. A few days after the Battle of Wesson, Haida again put to sea with Athabaskan. It was the same pair of Canadian ships that knew each other well from their joint exits. The night from the 28th to the 29th of April was one of the most tragic in this history. In the patrol area, the Canadians again encountered German torpedo ships. Contact occurred abruptly. At short distances, the enemy acted as those who rely on a torpedo act at sea. Strike and immediately force the enemy to defend. The torpedo hit Athabaskan. The loss of speed and fire meant that the ship could no longer maneuver as before. A stationary destroyer is a target at night. On the sea, at such moments, you cannot afford to have long The decision is made immediately. A rescue operation has begun for Haida. This is not a battle in the usual sense, but work in conditions where the enemy is still nearby and where the next torpedo may come at any moment. Haida approached the place of death cautiously. Her commander understood the risk. You can't stand still. You can't turn on an extra light. You can't create a predictable course. But to leave also meant leaving people in the water. Therefore, they acted as experienced crews do. They maneuver, keep up speed, lower the boat, throw lifebuoys, pull people on board by all available means. Cold water in spring makes time the enemy. It counts for minutes. A person without protection quickly loses strength, even if a piece of debris floats near. The raised people were immediately transferred to the hands of paramedics and volunteers who were free from combat posts. They took off their wet clothes, gave them dry clothes, gave them hot drinks, and warmed them up. The wounded were examined directly on the deck, because it is more difficult in tight passages. At the same time, the ship continued to maneuver. Rescue doesn't change the combat situation. The enemy might have returned. He could have tried to finish off both the Athabaskan and the gathering people. Therefore, Haida acted quickly and with restraint. At that moment, heroism did not look like a shout, but like a quiet work on the Several dozen people were saved. Some of the sailors of Athabaskan were picked up by German minesweepers later, and they became prisoners. For the Canadians, this was a difficult feeling because they were saving their own people nearby, while the rest went to the enemy. But that night, there was only the worst and the worst to choose from. It was impossible to stop the destroyer and wait for dawn. It was impossible to turn the rescue into a parking lot under torpedoes. Haida did what the conditions allowed and left, keeping the survivors she had raised alive. After the loss of Atbaskan, the crew's attitude to the war became even tougher. On paper, this is an episode. On the deck, it is empty seats and the memory of people who were seen yesterday. In the English Channel, a lot of things are decided by morality. If the crew falters, the ship starts to make mistakes, and you can't make mistakes at night. Therefore, on Haida, they tried to keep the usual order: shifts, inspections, training sessions, short reviews, so that everyone understands what to do at the next In the summer, Operation Neptune, the naval part of the Normandy landings, began. For destroyers like Haida, this meant guarding, patrolling, and preparing for night attacks by German boats. The Germans tried to fight their way to the transports and landing areas because at sea they could not defeat the Allies in terms of the number of ships, but they could try to hit the supply lines. The Allies responded with a network of patrols, lots of ships on the line, constant radar monitoring, quick response to any mark. Haida's work during these weeks was typical of coastal warfare. During the day, escort and cover. At night, search for contacts. Sometimes fire on coastal targets at the request of troops when it was necessary to suppress a battery or a point that interferes with movements on the Sometimes shooting at a target on the water if a boat or small vessel appeared. Sometimes it's just long hours on the course, when the radar screen shows only interference from waves and it's dark all around and you can hear the water hitting the side. In a documentary story, it is important to show that most of the time in war is waiting. A real battle can last only a few minutes, and preparation takes a day. Gun crews clean the barrels, check the feed mechanisms, replenish ammunition, learn to act on command and without a command if communication breaks. Signalmen keep their eyes on the horizon because one faint light can indicate a target. The machine command keeps the mode so that when an alarm is triggered, the ship can accelerate sharply and enter the attack course. By midsummer, the focus shifted further south to the Bay of Biscay. German garrisons in coastal ports were still receiving cargo by sea, fuel, ammunition, and the Allies sought to sever these routes. It wasn't romance, but logistics. If the port does not receive fuel, fewer boats leave. If fewer boats leave, there is less risk to Allied convoys and fewer. In early August, Haida was part of a group that entered the Ile-de-Jeux area at night. There, German minesweepers and patrol vessels escorted coastal traffic and held approaches to ports. The night battle in the area followed a familiar pattern. The radar detects contact. The commander puts the ship on a favorable course. Guns open fire at a distance where the target has not yet managed to disperse or go to the shore. The enemy responds if they have time, sometimes from the ship, sometimes from the shore, where the batteries are located. You can't linger near the shore. A destroyer lives on speed and maneuver, not armor. In that operation, the Allied group sank several German guard ships. For Haida, this meant accurate shooting, quick maneuvers, and constant monitoring of the situation. A successful fight does not mean that everything went without consequences. Even a single piece of shrapnel can kill a person on deck. 2 sailors died on Haida that night. In the report, these are 2 surnames. In the life of the crew, these are 2 empty bunks, 2 packages that will not be received at home, and 2 stories that are cut short due to a successful hit or accidental splinter. Haida's commanding officer during the key months was Harry de Wolf, an experienced officer who knew how to lead a ship in night combat and not waste an extra second in doubt. This is critical for a destroyer. On the bridge, the decision is made by one person, but it relies on dozens of correct actions below him. The radar post should give the range and bearing. The artillery post should quickly translate the data into a tip. The crews should open fire without delay, and the helmsman should keep the course so that the salvo falls accurately. In combat, it looks simple, but behind the simplicity is training. And after the battle exits in the Bay of Biscay, the ship needed to be repaired and replenished. At the end of the year, Haida went across the Atlantic to Canada for refit. This is standard practice. A destroyer that constantly maneuvers at high speed and fires wears out. It is necessary to check the hull, mechanisms, fire control devices, radar, communications. It is important to restore everything that has suffered from waves, vibrations, and combat loads. On the sea, even without hitting the equipment, gets tired. And the coastal service in France does not give it a careful Early the following year, Haida returned to Europe and joined the forces operating out of Scapa Flow. The setting here was different from the English Channel. More open sea, worse weather, different type of tasks. Instead of short duels near the coast, there were often long patrols and interceptions off the coast of Norway. The Germans still tried to transport along the fjords using the terrain and cover of coastal batteries. The Allies responded with raids and blockades. Their goal was the same: to deprive the enemy of freedom of movement and make them lose time and ship. The weather in the north was a threat in itself: icy wind, snow, wave, icing. The deck becomes slippery, visibility drops, hands get cold, and you need to work as fast as in the strait. Discipline is especially important in these circumstances. Any fuss leads to injuries, and injuries on a ship at sea are a problem for the entire. By the spring of 1945, German naval activity was declining sharply, but the danger remained. Mines, coastal batteries, individual ships that tried to break through, and the constant need to keep the sea under control. For the sailors, it looked like a continuation of the service without loud news. You stand on watch for hours, looking at the dark horizon line in the screen, and then in a minute, everything changes. An intercom command, calculations to the guns. The helmsman changes course, the engine room gives speed, and again a short voltage until the target disappears from the. After the German surrender, Haida prepared for possible service in the Pacific. Many Allied ships were then planned to be transferred to the new theater. But the war with Japan ended before these plans became a reality. For Haida, this meant returning to post-war service in a different world. The ship, which went through the coastal war in Europe and survived difficult nights, remained a part of the fleet's memory. Later, he served again, went to the Arctic regions, performed peacetime tasks. It was from such nights that the nickname Haida, later received, the most war ship of the Canadian Navy, was formed. It is important to understand that this is not a beautiful slogan. This is the result of statistics and crew memory, lists of sunk targets and lists of dead. In this sense, the history of Haida is a concentrate of the Canadian experience of the war at sea. A quick approach in the dark, a short distance, the risk of a torpedo, rescuing people from the water, and then heading back to patrol. Because pauses are rare in night operations in the English Channel during the summer and autumn of 1944 were almost uninterrupted. For Haida, it meant the same repetitive tension. In the evening, exit the base, move to the designated area, check communications, check the course, work radars. Then the most important thing is waiting for the contact. Sometimes the target appeared quickly. Sometimes the ship would stay on standby for hours, while the markings on the screen were just static from the wave. The opponent in this area rarely sought a fair fight on equal terms. German forces tried to take advantage of the proximity of the coast, speed, smoke production, and the torpedo threat. Outwardly, it looked like short encounters, but inside each episode, there was a lot of small work. It is necessary to hold the formation so that the Allied ships do not interfere with each other and do not cross the firing line. You need to keep your distance so that you don't get close to the torpedo, which goes in a straight line to the calculated course. You need to keep an eye on the coast because too close an approach can put the ship under fire from the battle. In June, after the landings, the flow of ships to Normandy became constant. The convoys were almost continuous. This increased both the cover-up tasks and the threat to those who held the guard. Any German group that could come out at night got a chance to hit the transport, and the transport is not a warship. This includes tonnage, fuel, equipment, and people. Therefore, the destroyers, including Haida, worked as a mobile barrier, blocking dangerous directions in the street. The scheme of night interception began with detection. The radar picked up the target, then the bridge clarified that it was not an Allied ship or its own group. Then the commander chose to approach so that his ship could open fire before the enemy had time to turn around and release torpedoes at a convenient distance. When the enemy put smoke, it was necessary to keep contact with the instruments and not lose the target from the sector. Losing a target in smoke means letting it go ashore and disappear among small craft, minefields, and reflections on the water. In these battles, the destroyer's artillery was decisive only when it was possible to keep the right distance and keep the pace of fire. But the rate of fire depends on the stability of the mechanisms and how quickly the ammunition is fed. The work of the crew looked without heroism like a heavy shift. Projectile, feed, shutter closing, shot, cartridge case ejection, feed again. At the same time, the deck could be flooded, there could be smoke around, and commands to change the lead could go through the headphones. Mines remained a separate problem. In the English Channel, many areas were dangerous even after trawling. Storms shifted mines, currents shifted positions. Sometimes a minefield could appear where it was not expected. Therefore, ships often went through known corridors, and any deviation required confirmation. In night conditions and at high speed, a navigation error could become an unmanageable situation. That is why in such operations, discipline at navigation posts was after the July fighting off the coast of Brittany. Allied destroyer activity against German coastal forces continued. The Germans tried to supply isolated garrisons, move cargo along the coast, and bring out submarine hunters and mine sweepers. For the Allies, such targets were important not in terms of volume, but in terms of effect. If a minesweeper is destroyed, it means that it is more difficult to keep passages in minefields. If a hunter is destroyed, it means that the transport has less cover. If a small transport is sunk, it means less fuel and less ammunition for the garrison. One of the typical tasks looked like this. A group of destroyers went out at night to the area where, according to intelligence, a convoy or a single ship should pass. The ships took up positions blocking possible escape routes. When contact was confirmed, rapprochement began. If the enemy tried to go to the shore, they tried to cut him off with a maneuver, forcing him to either take the fight or throw himself into shallow water. In such conditions, German crews often preferred to go under the cover of coastal lights and batteries. The Allies could fire in short bursts, but it was dangerous to stay close to the coast. By the autumn of 1944, some of the German ports on the Atlantic coast remained in the hands of garrisons and continued to be a source of threat. These were not points that defined the front on land, but they could create problems at sea. The Allies maintained a blockade and at the same time tried to prevent these garrisons from establishing naval supplies. The destroyers maintained this blockade, patrolling approaches, intercepting targets, and responding to reports of a possible enemy exit. During such months, the crew gets used to the fact that war is a routine in which every night can become a battle. Transitions, watches, readiness. Any short order can mean a sharp change in course and speed, followed by flashes of fire on the horizon. Inside the ship, all this is perceived not as an exception, but as the norm. They fire at the target as calmly as they work in the engine room. Calmness is not because there is no fear, but because without calmness, the ship loses control. By the end of the year and the beginning of 1945, Haida's primary mission had shifted to northern waters and interception operations off the coast of Norway. There, the nature of the work changed, but the logic remained the same. Intercept the target before it goes under the... Impose a battle so that the enemy cannot use the fjords as a shelter. At the same time, take into account coastal batteries and weather conditions, which in the north can instantly turn the operation into a struggle for controllability. In areas of the Norwegian coast, targets often tried to go under the very shore, using the terrain as protection. This forced the destroyers to act cautiously and quickly. It was impossible to stay in sight of the batteries for long. Therefore, the attack was based on a short approach and fire, then on withdrawal before the coastal guns had time to take aim. Here again, seconds decided. Once again, it was up to the training of the crew, who had to work in the dark, in bad weather, and under the constant threat of mines. In the winter of 1944 and in the first months of 1945, the northern waters became a separate front for the Allied destroyers. German shipping off the coast of Norway did not immediately disappear. It became more cautious, hiding more often under the shore and counting on batteries and complex navigation. Interception required ships that could quickly reach the area, detect the target at night, and act without long negotiations. Haida worked exactly in this mode. These weren't solo raids for effect. It was a systematic effort to disrupt transportation and deprive the enemy of fuel and cargo. In the north, much was decided by the weather. Wind, low cloud cover, snow, and wet fog worsened visibility and helped concealment at the same time. But they also made maneuvering near the shore more dangerous. The ship could lose its bearings, and in narrow places, this meant the risk of landing on rocks or entering the coastal strip where German batteries shoot at previously targeted sectors. Therefore, navigation followed strict procedures. Bearings, corrections, map reconciliation, and depth monitoring. It sounds boring in war, but in places like this, it's the boring routines that save the ship. The search for the target began with intelligence and patrol zones. Sometimes, the crew received information that at certain times, a transport under guard or a single vessel could leave the port. Sometimes, They went out on patrol without an exact target, blocking routes and forcing the enemy to either abandon the flight or risk a collision. Contact in such conditions could appear suddenly on the radar. This is first a point, then a refinement of the course and speed. If the mark went along the shore, it was clear that the target was trying to stay under protection. If the mark went out to sea, it could be a larger ship or an attempt to pass faster. When the target was confirmed, the chase and rapprochement began. A destroyer has a speed advantage but can't always use it. In case of heavy waves, the speed was limited so as not to break the bow structures and not risk damage to the equipment. Therefore, the commander chose the mode so as to keep contact and at the same time keep the ship in working order. On the sea, it is impossible to pretend that the equipment will withstand everything. It either holds up or fails at the worst possible. The artillery duel in northern waters looked different from that in the English Channel. In the Strait, they often worked at short distances, in a zone of heavy traffic and mines. In the north, the distance could be longer, but the danger from the shore and the batteries was constant. The challenge was to hit the target quickly without getting too close to the shore. If the target was a transport, a few hits could stop it from moving. If the target was an escort, it could try to cover the transport with smoke and divert the fire to itself. In this situation, clear prioritization was important. What's more important right now? Sink a transport or disable security so that you can get the transport later. This is always a calculation based on time and risk. At the same time, German ships could use torpedoes. Even if the target looks like a small vessel, it could have torpedo armament or be accompanied by a boat. Therefore, the destroyer could not go in a straight line for long. Maneuvering remained the rule. Zigzag, change course, control where the target is relative to the ship's course. For the crew, this meant constant commands to the helmsman and constant recalculations of lid in the fire control system. If the course changes, the decision to shoot also changes. This makes combat harder, but without it, a torpedo becomes too likely. In northern operations, communication within the group was of great importance. Destroyers rarely operated entirely alone. Even if the ship is visually alone in the frame, there were usually other Allied units nearby that kept the area or went on a parallel course. This made it possible to block the escape routes and create a situation for the target when it cannot just go to the side and disappear into the dark. But group work requires discipline. You can't cross paths under fire. You can't interfere with each other's radar. You can't give your opponent a chance to take advantage of the confusion. Therefore, the maneuver commands had to be short and unambiguous, and the order of actions was known in advance. At the end of the war, there was another problem at sea. Mines remained, and in some areas, they became the main threat, because there were fewer active collisions with enemy ships, but the mine danger did not go any. Even after the combat episodes, the destroyers continued to navigate the same waters where any deviation could lead to an explosion. This required constant concentration from the crew. From the outside, it doesn't look like an action game, but in reality, it's as much a part of warfare as our Haida's experience and reputation had already accumulated by this time. The ship participated in battles, survived campaigns, saw losses and rescues of people from the water. The crew understood that mistakes usually occur not because of a lack of courage, but because of fatigue, habit, automatism. So, an important part of the job was to prevent the war from becoming overconfident. At sea, self-confidence ends quickly. One wrong calculation of the distance to the shore, one extra risk in a minefield, and the story can end in a minute. As the war in Europe drew to a close, some of the tasks were reduced to controlling and intercepting the remaining traffic, and then to ensuring the transition to a peaceful regime. But even the last few weeks haven't been completely. German forces could operate in isolated bursts. Sea areas remained mined. Any change in the weather could disrupt the plan. Therefore, the ships maintained discipline until the very end. After the end of the war, Haida did not disappear from memory because it remained as a rare example of a Canadian warship that did not just participate in campaigns, but went through real collisions and survived. This is especially important for a documentary story. The ship became a museum ship because it has a history that can be shown not through legends, but through specific episodes. Night interceptions in the Strait, the Battle of Wesson, losing at Baskin and saving people, further operations off the coast of France, then northern raids and interceptions off Norway. This is a sequence that shows how a Canadian destroyer lived through the war from start to finish. If you put the April week in steps, you can see why it is often singled out as a peak of tension. In the evening, the ships leave Plymouth, go in the dark without unnecessary lights, keep in touch with short signals, and wait for marks on the radar. The German forces on the French coast are trying to do the same, go out, attack, and retreat to their batteries and minefields. In this game, the main danger is the torpedo. It gives no warning. It comes out of the dock and solves everything in seconds. Therefore, the destroyer constantly changes course, keeps speed, does not give the enemy a convenient angle, and tries to be the first to impose the distance of artillery combat. On the night of the battle, when Athabaskan was killed, Hyde Commander Harry DeWolf makes a decision, which is then discussed in detail in Canadian sources. On the one hand, there are people in the water nearby, and each of them is his own sailor, his own mechanic, his own gunner. On the other hand, German ships remain nearby, and at dawn, German patrols from the coast and aircraft can approach the... In the end, Haida saves 44 people, but cannot stay at the water indefinitely. This is something that sounds dry in the documentation, but in reality means a simple thing. The ship must simultaneously fight and pull out people without losing even more people. Immediately after this tragedy, the flotilla continues the battle. Hyde's Canadian record during these days includes the sinking of German ships off Wesson, including the torpedo boat Ta-27 in late April. For the documentary story, it is important that we are talking about a series of contacts in one area when ships act aggressively and bring the enemy to destruction, even if he tries to go under the cover of the... This period is well suited for the visual series because it gives several different scenes at once without making up. The bridge at night, where in the weak interior light, the officer listens to the radar report and translates it to the helmsman's command. Deck at the gun, where the crew works almost blindly, guided by flashes and tracks. Rescue team at the side, where hands grab the wet uniform and pull the person to the deck. A room where survivors sit by the heat, they are sheltered, given water, and a person stands next to them with a notebook, recording their names so as not to lose anyone a second time. Then, during the landing period, Hyde has a different routine. This is not the pursuit of a single ship, but a night service in an area where minesweepers, transports, boats, and aircraft work simultaneously. Therefore, the commander is forced to observe the corridors, not to enter the minefield zones, and at the same time stay close enough to intercept a German attempt to hit the sea communications. Such nights rarely produce one big episode. They give you the tension of waiting when a mark on the radar appears and disappears, and you need to understand whether it is a reflection of a wave, your boat, or an enemy who is hiding in By August, with the Allies already entrenched and the fighting shifting, German ships are trying to use the nights to hit communications off the coast. The Allied response is a destroyer hunt, and here Haida is back in her element. The night meeting at Ushant in late August was the result of just such an intercept. As a result of the battle, the German destroyer Z-32 is thrown ashore and destroyed, and German attempts to act in this direction noticeably weaken. It was nights like this that made Hyde what would later be officially called the Royal Canadian Navy's most successful ship in terms of enemy surface tonnage sunk in World War II. What matters is not so much the nickname itself, but the logic that leads to it. This is a ship that goes again and again where it is dangerous and does the work to the end. In the sea, this means finding a target, keeping contact, not letting go, and at the same time maintaining the course and handling, because one random torpedo will cancel out all success. At the same time, Haida does not turn into a story without people. The bridge watch, the gun crews, the signalmen, the mechanics who hold the course, and those who work with the radar and transmit short information to the bridge, which depends on whether the enemy will be seen. This is critical for a destroyer. I saw it first, so I chose the battle distance. I chose the distance, so I imposed the pace. Imposed tempo means that the opponent acts reactively and makes mistakes more often. This logic is repeated from night to night, and it is this logic that gives the result. After Ushant, work continues against the background of the liberation of French ports and the contraction of German capabilities. German ships go to more secure bases, start to act more cautiously, but this does not make the sea safe. Mines remain, aircraft work, and any movement near the shore can end up exploding without a fight. Therefore, the documents of the end of the year contain a lot of everyday words: patrol, escort, intercept. But behind them is the same reality of night shifts, when the crew does not sleep and knows that the battle can start at any. An important detail that is often overlooked is that for such battles, you need not only weapons, but also fuel, ammunition, repairs, and people. A destroyer is not an autonomous hero. He keeps to the base, where he replenishes shells and torpedoes, repairs damage from shrapnel and heavy seas, checks the mechanisms. After a night battle, the ship can return with holes and a tired crew, and after a short time again, go into the dark, because the strait does not wait, and the German boats leave as soon as they see a chance. This is how the image of Hyde in the English Channel develops. This is not one grand day battle, but a series of night actions, where the Canadian ship enters the danger zone again and again, takes contact, shoots, maneuvers, picks up people, and returns only to come out again a day later. At such distances and in such a war, there is no place for long speeches. There are short commands, precise procedures, and one goal, so that the German coast at night is not a corridor, but a